In a homily reflecting on the doubting St. Thomas, Pope St. Gregory the Great declared, quote, "Do you really believe that it was by chance that this chosen disciple was absent, then came and heard and doubted, doubted and touched, touched and believed? It was not by chance, but in God's providence. In a marvelous way, God's mercy arranged that the disbelieving disciple, in touching the wounds of his master's body, should heal our wounds of disbelief. The disbelief of Thomas has done more for our faith than the faith of the other disciples. As he touches Christ and is won over to belief, every doubt is cast aside and our faith is strengthened. So the disciple who doubted, then felt Christ's wounds, becomes a witness to the reality of the resurrection." Close quote. Dr. Christopher Kaczor, on his enlightening new book, Is Belief Believable? Reasoning About God from Plato and Aquinas to C.S. Lewis and Jordan Peterson, now. My name is Tod Worner, and this is the Evangelization Culture Podcast from Word on Fire. Dr. Christopher Kaczor is professor of philosophy at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles and president of the American Catholic Philosophical Association, founded in 1926. He graduated from the honors program of Boston College and earned a PhD 4 years later from the University of Notre Dame. A Fulbright scholar, Dr. Kaczor did postdoctoral work as an Alexander von Humboldt German Chancellor Fellow at the University of Cologne. He was appointed a corresponding member of the Pontifical Academy for Life of Vatican City, an honorary professor of the Word on Fire Institute, and William E. Simon Visiting Fellow in the James Madison Program at Princeton University. The winner of a Templeton Grant, he has written more than 130 scholarly articles and book chapters. An award-winning author, his 20 books include Is Belief Believable? Praying Like St. Augustine, Jordan Peterson, God and Christianity, The Search for a Meaningful Life, among others. Dr. Kaczor's views have been aired in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, Huffington Post, National Review, on all variety of television stations, and of course, the Today Show. Dr. Christopher Kaczor, welcome.
Thank you, Tod. I appreciate all the kind words. It makes me happy to hear, nice words from people. When I turned 51, my daughter came to me in all seriousness, and she said, "Dad, do you miss being young and handsome?" Isn't that great?
Happy birthday, by the way.
Happy birthday. I love you. And what made it so funny is that she is such a sweet person, and she had no ill will at all.
Exactly. Oh, man. Okay. Segment 1, asking questions about God. In the poem, When I Heard the Learned Astronomer, Walt Whitman writes, quote, "When I heard the learned astronomer, when the proofs, the figures were ranged in columns before me, when I was shown the charts and diagrams to add, divide, and measure them, when I, sitting, heard the astronomer, where he lectured with much applause in the lecture room, how soon, unaccountable, I became tired and sick, till rising and gliding out, I wandered off by myself in the mystical moist night air, and from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars." Close quote. So, Christopher, just as Walt Whitman in his poem is left cold by sterile science isolated from the eternal, we too hunger for the transcendent and the ineffable. This poem seems in its own way to testify to Pascal's God-shaped hole or St. Augustine's restless heart. So I want to begin this question specifically about your book, Is Belief Believable? Why do we possess this restless heart and ask penetrating questions about God?
I think the reason that we have a restless heart and we ask so many questions has to do with the nature of both the human mind and the human will. So the human mind is naturally curious, and that's why even small children ask over and over again, why? And you give them an answer, and they say, well, why is that? And give you an answer, well, why is that? And they take apart their toys. They want to see how things are put together. I remember when I was a kid, I took apart my bicycle and I couldn't put it back together. My dad wasn't very happy about that. But we are naturally curious, and our mind seeks to know the truth. But we're also, as we get older, we become aware that our perspective on the truth is always partial. No one can say, I know the truth absolutely and completely. And so this quest for knowledge and this quest for truth is really ongoing, but it can't ever be satisfied in this life. And even if you live to be 100 years old and you study like crazy, you never reach the point where you say, well, I really have arrived at complete knowledge. And what would it mean to arrive at complete knowledge? Well, I think that would mean to have as complete of understanding of the truth as you can have.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one way of understanding what heaven is, because God is the truth. You may have heard this sort of phrase, but Aquinas thinks that's actually something that we can understand through reasoning. And his way of thinking about it is that what the truth is a correspondence of mind and reality. And he gets this definition of truth from Aristotle. And so if we think of truth as a correspondence of mind and reality, then we can also talk about the reality that God's mind and God's reality are perfectly united. In other words, God perfectly knows himself. But if that's what truth is, that would mean that God is ultimate truth. God is, in other words, the first truth on which all other truths are based. All other created truths that we've discovered here and now about medicine or about architecture or about whatever else we discover. Those all ultimately depend on the first truth, that is, they depend on God. So I think the mind is naturally restless and it wants the fullness of truth. And the will, likewise, is restless. And the will is restless because it always wants what's good. We want good food, we want good afternoon, we want to read good books, we want goodness, but all goodness that we find here below is, like the truth we find here below, partial, not total, not complete. And so, yes, we have a good meal, but then when it's done, it's over and that's the end of it. We have a good friendship, but even the best of friends aren't in perfect harmony with each other all the time. And so we want this perfect goodness and we want this perfect truth, but we can't find either one of these things here below. And finally, I think we want perfect love. And yet, even the most loving relationship that we can find on earth, maybe a husband and wife who, get married when they're 20 and are together their whole lives and they love each other like crazy. Well, yes, that's very beautiful. And that is a kind of window, a kind of sign of God's love. And yet, if you talk to them and say, well, is your spouse perfect? Is your love perfect? No, they're going to have their moments of disagreement and their butting of heads. And I think it's actually a reality that every couple has irreconcilable differences. So we are searching for perfect truth, perfect goodness, and perfect love. And yet here below, we just can't find any of those three things. And so that's really what heaven is. It's when we have a perfect relationship with perfect truth, perfect goodness, and perfect love.
So let me ask you this, Christopher, because I thought about this as you're describing it. This is the state of our broken existence, right? After the fall, the rupture between us and God, and the forever attempt to reconcile ourselves with God through the grace of Christ. Clearly, there's a tragedy in that sense that we live a life that we can never achieve more than a partial sense of the truth. But is there also? Would you say there's also? Something that is. It's weird to say something that is good about that not arriving at full truth in the here and now, but it does motivate us. It does motivate us to search for the truth, to aspire to that perfect love, to that perfect goodness, to that perfect truth. So in a way, in our brokenness, is it okay for me to say it's a goad for us to move towards it, or would you say it's uniformly bad? We're stuck with a tough deal in the sense that we've fallen, we're separated, and we live with partial truth. And the true goodness ultimately resides in heaven, and so therefore we suffer until we get there. What's your sense about that?
I guess my sense is more like the former rather than the latter. Yeah. So I do think that the recognition that you don't know is actually a step towards greater enlightenment. Very famously, Socrates said that he was certain of one thing that he didn't know, but that put him ahead of his peers who had a false certainty. And they thought they knew all sorts of things, but in fact, they didn't really know. And that's part of what Socratic dialogue is about, is uncovering actually the ignorance of people who claim to have real knowledge. And so I think it's a step in the right direction to recognize the partiality of our knowledge and the partiality of our seeking of the good, and also the partiality of our love. I think one way to go really wrong is, say with love, would be if you made an idol out of the person that you loved.
Yeah.
If you sort of made it as if, my husband or my wife or boyfriend or girlfriend or whoever is God, absolutely perfect. And so I'm going to find my perfect fulfillment in this relationship with this person. Well, you can do that, but I think, like all idols, it's going to break under the pressure
Yeah.
of, you know, trying to imitate God in that way. So I think it's a step forward. I think it's a step in the right direction to recognize our fragility, our dependence, and actually recognizing that dependence can actually be a kind of key for gaining a proper independence, a proper freedom to love God and to love others.
So Christopher, over centuries, despots have crushed, ideologies have brainwashed, and pleasures have sedated the faithful. But the perennial question about God returns again and again. So what does the tenacity of our sense of God tell us about his reality?
Well, I think it is interesting how this question of God is, despite all these obstacles, a recurring question in every generation. And I think that we see in our own day, in our own generation, a real resurgence and renaissance of belief in God. There's as you probably know, a large number of public intellectuals who have, in the last 3, 5 years, declared either their openness to faith or, in some cases, even adopted Christianity.
Yeah.
And so I think this is a sign, you might say, of the power of the Christian idea that, despite it being buried, it ends up, rising from the dead, as it were, again and again, and bearing its own undertakers. And I think there's a line, you may remember it from, was it Chesterton or maybe Heller Belloc, that talks about this very point, right? That Christianity is said to have been failed and died, and yet here it is centuries later, after the Roman emperors tried to destroy it, after the French Revolution tried to destroy it,
Yep.
after the communists tried to destroy it. I mean, there's just been wave after wave of these attempts to uproot, destroy, eradicate Christianity, and yet here the Catholic Church is outliving the Roman Empire, outliving the excesses of the French Revolution, outliving the Soviet Union. And so we find ourselves still standing despite some bruises and
Yeah.
difficulties over time.
It's incredible. It reminds me of that story about Cardinal George, standing on the balcony next to the newly named Pope and
Mm-hmm.
surveying the scene. And they said, "What were you look so pensive? What were you thinking at that time?" And he says, "Look at, here, Caesar lorded it over all of Rome. Where is Caesar now? He isn't here. And where is St. Peter? He's standing right next to me." I mean, so this, again, to your point about the faith outlasting its conquerors, which is an extraordinary thing. The search for or the questioning about God can sometimes usher earnest debate into fiery argument. So, in your introduction to this terrific book, Is Belief Believable?, you unfold a story, to use the words of Chesterton, about, quote, not letting a quarrel get in the way of an argument, close quote. I want you to tell us the story about your wife and her father.
Yeah. So my father-in-law,
Father-in-law,
my
yeah.
wife, yeah, my father-in-law, my wife's father, he left the Catholic Church in about 1972 when he came out as gay. And so he was away from the church for decades, 30, 40 years. And basically, uh, when he came out as gay, divorced my wife's mother, and so my wife was raised, with a single parent and such, and that was very challenging. I mean, they were on food stamps. He wasn't supportive, and God bless him, but he was a kind of cantankerous person. So his personality kind of butted heads with my wife, and so she really had to work super hard to maintain a relationship. I mean, she'd call him on the phone, but she almost was like a diplomat who was choosing her words extremely carefully so as to avoid trouble. But that kind of changed. We spent a year in Princeton, and my father-in-law Dennis lived in New York City, and so that's a relatively close distance. And so basically, we went in to New York City, and we saw him maybe every 3 weeks or so. And the relationship kind of continued to develop. And I really give credit to my wife because she really took the commandment, honor your father, not as a suggestion, but as a commandment. And so she really made really heroic efforts to do this. And so we spent a lot of time with him. We befriended him. He's legally married, befriended his legal husband. And then at the end of our stay, we were heading back to Los Angeles, and he was staying there in New York. And so we were kind of saying goodbye. And his legal husband said to me, when I met you, Chris, I thought that you would hate me. I'm a Jew. I'm an atheist, I'm gay. And I thought, this guy's going to absolutely hate me. And he said, you've been nothing but kind to me the whole time. And, my wife said goodbye to her husband. And we all knew this would be, her dad, we all knew this would be the last time we'd ever see him, because over the course of this time, he had gotten sicker and sicker. And so, this was our final farewell in person. So we parted ways. And my wife kept in touch with him, and her dad got more and more sick. And finally, he entered kind of a hospice care situation. And the nurse said, look, I think your dad's going to die in probably the next week or so. He's really getting to the end. And so I said to Jennifer, I said, well, maybe we should try to get a priest to come in. I mean, I don't know if he'd be open to that, but maybe he could, have confession, get the sacrament, have last rites. And so my wife called her dad, and he said, she said to him, can we have a priest come out and give you last rites? And her dad said, I don't need last rites. I'm not going to die anytime soon. And, he just was in total denial. So then she's smart. So she said, well, okay, how about not last rites, but we'll have a priest come out and pray with you. He said, oh yeah, that'll be fine. Prayer, anointing of the sick. So last rites was out, but anointing of the sick was fine. So priest came out, and we got a priest to come to him, and it was really beautiful. He heard his confession, first confession in I'm trying to think exactly how long it would be, 40 some years, maybe 50 years. I mean, a long time. Gave him his final Holy Communion, last rites. And then the nurse said that the priest left him with a crucifix, and the nurse told us he wouldn't let go of it. Wow. He just held it all the time. And so she washed his hands around the crucifix.
That's incredible.
It was a beautiful story. And I really give all the credit to my wife, because I think there's a lot of daughters who would have said, Dad, it's over. You're not going to see the grandkids. We're not going to talk. I'm just done with you. And she didn't. She was such a good daughter. It's really impressive to me how she maintained this relationship despite disagreements. I mean, we had different religious views, we had different political views, and we didn't let any of that get in the way of trying to, be part of a family. Because I think, look, families have disagreements sometimes, but especially if you're Christian, I think you're called to love everyone. But first of all, your family, your immediate people that are immediately around you. Yeah. We don't want to be like that character in one of the Dickens novels who had telescopic philanthropy, that she's so concerned about people off in Africa or whatever, that she ignores and neglects and even harms the people in her personal family and orbit. So anyway, that's the story I talk about in the beginning of the book. And the point of that is in part to encourage people to make their conversations about faith within the context of love, within the context of actually caring about someone and wanting what's best for them, and not within the context of, I'm right, you're wrong. I'm a UFC fighter. I'm going to get in the ring and, and butt heads with you. Yes, sometimes we have to disagree. Sometimes we have to have different perspective. That's okay. But again, I think the overall context and ambiance of all that should be a fundamental conviction that, look, I care about you. I love you. I want what's best for you. I want a relationship with you. And yes, we may have disagreements. That's okay. That does not need to get in the way of actually loving each other.
I was just talking to somebody yesterday about the notion of civil debate and discussion. This goes back to the Chesterton notion of not letting a quarrel get in the way of an argument. And I think, if you look at Once Upon a Time, I'd watch these old firing lines with William F. Buckley, and I was watching this one where George McGovern was on one side and Buckley was on the other, and they believed dramatically different things, but it was profoundly civil, even friendly. A lot of exchanges of humor and light banter and wit and so on, but still also delving into the topics that matter and so on. And if you move in fast forward into the future, whether it's angry sound bites or put downs or just categorical thinking that just has no room, no charity for the other person, or a sense that if you don't arrive where I want you to arrive right here and now, we're done. And not only are we done talking, we're done in our relationship. And I just think this is such a powerful introduction to a book that asks fundamental questions about God. And that is, it leads off with the notion of willing the good of the other. And I know it's probably been misattributed, but you know Aquinas way better than I do. I think it was they say Aquinas said something along the lines of, if you want to convert somebody, take them by the hand and guide them. Whether he said that or not, the point is the charitable notion of walking beside somebody and not taking a ball-peen hammer and smacking them in the head and then leaving them behind and saying, well, you didn't get it, so we're done. I just think you really embody that so well, not only in that story, but in the introduction that leads us into these questions.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I try to do that. I don't always succeed. I also, in the introduction, I think I talk about a Christmas that we had with my family, where all of a sudden somebody said, well, wasn't Jesus married to Mary Magdalene and had kids with her and this and that?
Merry
the
Christmas.
Thing is, it's like, Merry Christmas, exactly. So now who wants to open the first present, So anyway, it kind of opened up this huge thing. And the thing is, I did not handle it very well at the time. And I wish I could go back in time with so many things I've done and sort of say, okay, if I could do that over, how would I handle it? And now I think, if I had my wits about me, I would have said something like, that is a great question, and I want to talk to you about that, in length. So how about tomorrow we go for lunch, we go for a walk, and let's really hash this out, because I think it's a great question, and I'm interested to understand why you think this view and how you arrived at this perspective. It's great topic. But is it okay for right now, since we're about to open presents, and this might kind of derail us if we just focus on the presents? So anyway,
I've discovered that I want to spend birthdays and holidays with the Kazors, because it sounds like there's a lot of great conversations that arise. So Christopher, St. John Paul II once wrote, and you open your book with this: faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. And God has placed in the human heart a desire to know the truth, in a word, to know himself, so that by knowing and loving God, men and women may also come to the fullness of truth about themselves. So in your book, Is Belief Believable? You tell us that, quote, a fundamental theme of this book is that faith and reason are not opposed, close quote. So how does reason edify faith, as opposed to the popular misconception that it dismantles it? And how does faith augment reason, as opposed to the popular misconception that it dilutes it?
Yeah, those are great questions. So I do think that faith and reason really do work in harmony, and yet it's also true that they have different roles. So your first part of your question, if I remember correctly, is, well, how does reason help faith? Mm-hmm. And I think reason helps faith in part by helping faith to avoid a kind of distortion of faith, which I'll call superstition. So there are manifestations of a distorted faith that really are very superstitious, right? Where you think, I don't know, every thing that happens in your life is a direct sign either from the devil or from God, and then you go about trying to interpret every single sign that happens. And I think you can lead yourself into a kind of superstitious state in which you detach yourself from focusing on the realities that actually matter. And just to be clear, I'm not denying that there are signs. I'm not denying that sometimes maybe even the devil does do whatever to you. But if you're saying the devil's really attacking me, and you're like, oh my gosh, what's wrong? Well, the hair dye that I bought didn't turn out very well. It's like, well, I don't know if the devil's super concerned with you getting the right color hair dye. It seems like maybe the devil has a few other, key issues to deal with other than your hair dye. So, you could get someone who's sort of attributing to demonic powers. And I think reason can kind of clarify that, say, okay, hold on, wait. Yes, there could be demonic activity, but probably not involved in that kind of trivial sort of thing like that.
Sure.
On the other hand, how does faith help reason? Well, reason can get off track. It's pretty easy for reason to fail to see things that are actually pretty clear. And a great example of this, I think, was in the Third Reich, where you had intelligent, educated people who somehow became blind to very basic moral truths that faith enunciates. Truths like don't murder innocent people. Yeah. This should be crystal clear according to reason. In other words, anyone whose reason's operating properly should be able to see it's wrong to murder innocent people. And yet it turned out in the Third Reich that it was people of faith whose reason maintained that clarity. Yeah. In other words, you had both Protestants and Catholics who stood up against what the Nazis were doing. And I think part of that was faith. In other words, their faith bolstered their reason, strengthened their reason to be able to reason properly and not to arbitrarily and unjustly exclude some human beings from the ambit of human dignity. And so faith and reason, I think, really do work together. Faith helps reason, reason helps faith. And so, again, I think John Paul II's example is very to the point that you can think about it like two wings that help a bird to fly up towards the truth. And you need both wings. A bird does not fly very well if it just has one wing. It needs both wings.
Yeah.
And likewise, I think that we are able to live well when we have faith and reason working in harmony.
So your book is divided into three sections: obstacles to belief in God, reasons for belief in God, and believing in the God of the Bible. And each section offers 3 to 5 page considerations of questions, and there's 51 questions in total, such as, is God too good to be true? Or what causes the universe, or caused the universe? And does Jesus reveal God, among many others? We're gonna talk about some of the other ones. How did you decide on what questions to ask and answer?
I guess I was led partly by my sense from talking with students about what questions are on their minds and what obstacles they have to faith. So one of the great things about being a professor is that every semester I have classes that I teach, and most of the students are new. Some take my class multiple times, different classes, but most of the time they're new. And so you always get new questions and new perspectives and difficulties that they're struggling with. And so this book arises out of a course that I've taught called The God of Faith and Reason. And I've used different readings in the course and taught it in different ways. But I think I kind of do have a sense of, in general, where at least a lot of college students are coming from. And basically, there's many college students that share a belief in common, even if they disagree about lots of other things. So you have, say, in my teaching, sometimes I'm teaching serious Catholics, people that go to Mass every day and say the Rosary. They're very serious. And then I'll also have people in class that have blue hair, they, them pronouns, atheist, agnostic, aggressive about it. And then there's people kind of in the middle, like, I was baptized and I go to Mass with grandma at Easter, but that's about it. I don't really, that's the extent of my faith. But all these three groups, right, the devout, the atheistic, and the kind of, lukewarm, you might call them, they all agree or think that faith and reason are opposed. So to teach this class has been really great because, they actually all share this supposition. The really devout students sometimes think faith and reason are opposed. They choose faith. The agnostic students, the atheistic students think faith and reason are opposed. They choose reason. And so to introduce these students to a reasonable faith and a faithful reason is really quite a joy, because I feel like I'm unveiling something that maybe not on their radar at all. And so the book kind of arose out of that I hope to, not just for the 28 students I have in class, but for a wider audience, to share the insight, really not original at all with me. And this is something coming from Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, John Paul II, and really the whole Catholic tradition about this harmony of faith and reason. So I'm happy to be able to have a wider audience to share these insights with.
So let me ask you this, Christopher. When you are in that class and you have, some of the people that are very, they're atheistic or they're very opposed to religion and so on. And I don't know if they're taking your class as an elective or if there's a required element. I think there's probably an elective class, so they're opting to take this class. What's your sense about how they receive these arguments that you're outlining in this book in particular? And do you find that the needle moves on them? Do you find it's a lot of opposition that is opposition in defiance of reason and good faith arguments? What's been your experience with this good material and some of the obstinate perspectives of some of those atheistic students?
Well, I would say that in my class, I tried not to make it oppositional at all.
Yeah.
Right. So I want to avoid, and I think I mostly do avoid, a kind of boxing match where it's like, well, we're just going to fight it out. We're going to be, so it's more when I'm teaching, I'll present someone's view. Let's say I'll present Aquinas's view that there has to be a first cause. And then I'll say, okay, well, here's his view. Do you have any questions about what Aquinas thinks? And then sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And then I'll say, well, okay, what would you say would be the strongest reasons to reject Aquinas's view?
Hmm.
Like, how would you call that into question? And they'll come up with different things, like, well, couldn't there be, two uncaused causes, or 10 or 37 or 3,000?
Mhm.
Because in some chains of causality, like if you think about human reproduction, it's not just the mother or just the father, it's both. There needs to be two causes. So couldn't you have two uncaused causes that are bringing about the whole world? So they'll raise lots of objections of all kinds of different objections. And so, we talk about those and entertain those. And so, I try not to make it like, I'm right, you're wrong, we're getting in a fight, you're dumb, or, it's like, no, I would think, at least, if you're a college student, you're not dumb. You're smart. You got into college. By the time they take my class, they're a junior or senior typically.
Yeah.
So you're an educated person. So I try to approach it with a kind of mutual respect and try, if I can, to be, rather than I'm right, you're wrong, more like, hey, let's together
Collaboratively
explore this interesting, issue, this interesting question. Now, obviously, I have my own views, and obviously, I want to share what I think is true with the students. But I try not to, again, have it be like, well, we're going to fight it out or something.
Yeah. Very good. Out of curiosity, among the 51 questions you have in this book, are there one or two that are absolutely the predominant questions your students ask? Or would you say no? It's all these different. I mean, it's these. And I know these questions originate from what you've encountered among your students. Also, what kind of has bubbled up in your mind throughout your education, your experience, and so on. But would you say that there are a couple of questions here that are just heads above others in terms of what the young mind is sort of trying to grapple with?
Yeah, I'd say one of the key issues is the relationship of science and religion, or science and faith. And I do think this is something that almost all the students somehow have just in their gut, a gut feeling that somehow you have to choose. And so many times they're surprised to learn about the history of science, how many of the most prominent and important scientists of all time were not atheists, but in fact were people of faith. So people like Copernicus, who was a Catholic cleric, people like Father Greg Mendel, the founder of modern genetics, people like Father George Lemaitre, the founder of the Big Bang cosmology, and also people like Isaac Newton, who was a very serious Christian, who wrote actually almost as much commentary on the Bible as he did about physics. So in all these people make very clear that you can be not just a scientist, but you can be one of the most important scientists of all time and still be someone who is Christian, who has faith. These really are no more opposed than being a great athlete and being a Christian, or being a great artist like Da Vinci or Michelangelo or Andy Warhol and being a person of faith. So people unfortunately do, or some people at least have this sort of gut feeling or this sort of instinctual idea that faith and reason are opposed. And I think part of the reason for that is the American context, where Protestant fundamentalists in the early 20th century read Genesis in such a way that it caused a huge conflict to arise between the beginning of the Bible and evolution. And so that's part of what we talk about in the class as we read. I have them read the first 3 chapters of Genesis, and I point out that to interpret this story, like to interpret any text at all, it's vital, it's absolutely crucial to understand the context, and it's crucial to understand the genre. And if we don't do this, we're going to have a very unintelligent reading of the text. It'd be similar to if you read a Shakespearean sonnet, right? You read Sonnet 18, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short of date." So let's say you read that and you're like, well, okay, Shakespeare is telling me about the weather. He's saying there are rough winds in May, and I look up in the weather almanac. Oh no, there's no rough winds in May, according to this weather almanac. Like, that's a crazy, insane way to read Sonnet 18.
Right.
Well, Shakespeare's not trying and failing to be a weather reporter. He's just not doing that. And if you're reading it as a weather report, it's like, you're just reading it totally, you're on the wrong page with
Yeah.
that, because you're totally misunderstanding the genre. So what I try to do with my students is put the text of Genesis back into its original context, which is not, this is a contemporary account of science for or against evolution. It's just not trying to do that at all. What it is trying to do is trying to be a creation story. And I point out to the students, there are rival creation stories all around at the time, before and after the Genesis account, right? There's the Babylonian account, there's Egyptian accounts, there are a number of Greek accounts. And so I talk about some of those other accounts and put Genesis in conversation with those accounts. And then when I think Genesis is put back into its context and understood as a creation account, and then you see it in conversation with these other accounts, then I think the truths that Genesis is teaching become more clear.
Sure.
And I think they really are truths. They really are truths. And the truths that Genesis is teaching us, when you see it in opposition to these other creation accounts, those truths would be things like the universe is orderly. The universe is intelligible. The universe is not, as many of the other rival creation accounts held, the result of chaotic, random violence, just stuff just happening like a battlefield.
Yeah.
Because at the end of a battle, you don't have order on the battlefield. You just have random stuff all over, right?
Yeah.
Like a
Yeah.
shard of this and a broken that and just stuff. It's just a mess. But Genesis is saying that all creation is ordered and orderly and intelligible. And in fact, even though Genesis is not doing science, that is the presupposition of science. Science can't get off the ground unless it presupposes that the world is intelligible, understandable, orderly, and then science tries to investigate and understand the order that is in creation, that is in the universe. So anyway, that I would say is probably the most common sort of hang up or block or problem that my students run into.
From the genetic fallacy to the induction fallacy, from self-defeating reasoning to good old-fashioned laziness, you do a marvelous job, Christopher, in revealing the sloppy thinking that can lead to the rejection of God. And you're very charitable. You're not calling it sloppy thinking, but you show that there are people shortcutting logic to arrive at answers, and therefore it becomes sloppy. Dismayed by an opponent's terrible reasoning, William F. Buckley Jr. once quipped, quote, "I won't insult your intelligence by suggesting that you really believe what you just said," close quote. I just want to ask you, and this, again, understandingly that you would approach this very charitably, but I ask this question for a little effect. How much of atheism, to your way of thinking, is simply bad thinking?
Well, I would say that the atheists I've talked to almost always have a limited range of understanding of philosophy. So what I mean is, there's some atheists that are extremely smart. I'm thinking in particular of a relative of mine who was a professor at Princeton. And he's a scientist, and really a smart person. I mean, just brilliant. And he is brilliant in his field. But if you get out of your fields, even if you're really brilliant about the nature of insects or whatever, well, that doesn't give you insight into metaphysics or into human anthropology or into ethics so philosophy, in a way, because it's a comprehensive discipline and a foundational discipline, is of its very nature approaching these sorts of questions, and if you don't have that training and you don't have that background, then you can kind of just think, oh, well, it's obvious that whatever. And it turns out, if you think about it for a while, it's really not obvious that whatever. And philosophy, I think one of the advantages of it is, particularly if you have an historical training where you've read through the history of philosophy, because many of the views that seem new to us today are actually a recycled version of things that were said by David Hume or Thrasymachus or John Stuart Mill or whoever. And so if you have a sense of the history of philosophy, you've read these different authors, it makes it easier to see, oh, well, this is kind of a version of David Hume's objection or whatever. And if you've already wrestled with that and struggled with that, it really gives you a huge advantage. So I would say that for many people who are atheists, they may be extremely intelligent. I mean, just geniuses in terms of, again, I don't know, their study of ice or whatever it is that they're studying. But again, that expertise in one area does not also license you to say, well, now I also know about the whole history of philosophy. I'm also an expert in metaphysics, an expert in whatever else. So I guess that's sort of the difficulty. Is sometimes people, I think, can mistakenly think that they have knowledge about one thing because they have such a deep knowledge about something else.
Segment 2, on the obstacles and reasons to believe. St. John Henry Newman once wrote, quote, 10,000 difficulties do not make one doubt, close quote. In other words, having questions about Catholic doctrine does not mean having to outright reject it. So, Christopher, let's explore some of the questions you ask and answer in Is Belief Believable? The stick most commonly used to beat religion, like we talked about, is science with a capital S. And this scientific argument that most commonly tries to dismiss faith rests on a notion of materialism. And what you've divided into, and I think it's a brilliant insight, specifically ontological materialism and methodological materialism. So let's explore this question. Does science disprove God?
Yeah, so let's start with this distinction that you just drew between ontological materialism and methodological materialism. And you might think about it in terms of playing chess. So if you and I are playing chess, part of the game of chess is that the pieces on the chessboard can only move in a certain way, right? Queens can move all over the place, but if you have a knight, it has to go forward and then to the side. And so basically all the pieces have their own ways of moving. And so when we're playing chess, we have to pretend that the only ways these pieces can move is just in terms of the rules of chess. Likewise, if we're playing basketball, right? In basketball, you can't just grab the ball and run down the court, right? You have to dribble the basketball. So different games and different practices have different rules for those games and practices. When you're doing mathematics, you just consider the numbers involved, right? You don't consider, it's not relevant for mathematics whether the problem is written in black ink or blue ink, whether the numbers are written in huge, big font, 18-point font or 9-point font. None of that matters for mathematics. 2 + 2 = 4, whether it's gigantic font or tiny font. Whether it's blue, black, pink, it doesn't matter what the color. So what I'm getting at is methodologically in mathematics, we bracket certain realities, like how big is the font? What color is the font? In basketball, we bracket certain realities. We're just focusing on, the court. We're not concerned about something happening across the world and whatever. We're just focusing when we're playing basketball, qua basketball on the court. And likewise, when we're doing science, we focus on things as quantifiable. We focus on things as measurable. Now, that is not to deny the reality that there are non-quantifiable characteristics of the things that we're talking about. So not everything that's measurable is the limit of what's actually real. In other words, there are many things that we haven't measured and even things we can't measure that nevertheless really are real. I mean, one reality I think that almost everyone can recognize as real is the reality that our parents love us, right? Now, I know my mom loves me. How, if I measure that, is it like 20 units of love? Is it weigh 15 pounds of love? Well, no, it's not. It's a reality. It's a truth, but it's not measured. I don't have a, it's not 27 feet long or something, 27 feet long worth of love. So there are realities that are really true and also realities that are vitally important that aren't measurable. So I think we can do science. And when we're doing science, we say, look, we're limiting ourselves in this discussion to simply things that are quantifiable, measurable. And again, that's methodological materialism. We're just measuring and, the things that are the natural things. But that's different than an ontological materialism. That's where you say all that exists is what's measurable. All that exists is what's quantifiable. All that exists is what's material. And that makes no more sense than saying of pieces on a chessboard, well, the only way they can move is in terms of the rules of chess. Or the only thing that exists when you're playing basketball is the court. There's no such thing as Antarctica. Well, no, I mean, that's still there. Yes, you're focusing just on the court, but there are other things outside the court. So I guess this drift that can happen where you move from a naturalistic method in this practice to therefore saying, well, now I have to apply that to all of reality. And I think that's sort of where the problem arises.
Yeah, it makes it makes so much sense what you're saying, because one of the things that I found is that, with the scientific method, it is great for what it's designed to do, but it is not equipped to speak profoundly on things that transcend the scientific method. And it seems that when someone says, well, we can't measure this, the fault lies in the thing being measured as opposed to the tool being used to measure it. And so it's sort of like, the scientific method should stay in its lane. But when it comes to bigger issues of theology, I mean, there's a science to theology and there's a science to history and all that kind of stuff. But there are certain things that transcend the classic material scientific method, and I think the problem is just misapplication. Like you said, how do you measure love? How do you measure loyalty? These studies that are like, let's just study and see if someone prays and then someone doesn't, does it then have this outcome? That just as if that alone is going to be, we can have God be beholden to this scientific method. And the other thing I say in my practice in the field of medicine, even our gold standard studies, our randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials with hard endpoints, they can be flawed, and they can ultimately be disproven by a subsequent study of similar caliber and so on. And so it's always interesting to me about the worship of science as this infallible articulator of all truths on all things and period, hard stop, when in fact it's a wonderful tool, but it's sort of a lousy panacea or a lousy God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree. Those are really great points. And as a physician, I think you recognize. I mean, one way to think about it is, as a physician, you treat, and it's such an important vocation, the diseases of the body. But we as human beings are multidimensional, right? We have a body, and yes, we get sick, and we need a doctor. We need you to come in and help us all the time. Yes, that's totally true. But there's other dimensions to being human. For instance, there's a dimension of us that you might call personal relationships. So if I have a problem with my wife, I'm not going to go to my general practitioner physician and ask for marital advice, like how do I negotiate this difficulty. If I have financial problems, right, could be a reality. I'm not going to go to the doctor and say, hey, doctor, I'm wondering about where to invest my stock. Or,
you definitely don't ask me that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the doctor just coincidentally is good at that, but there's no reason for that.
Yeah.
So I think science has this in no ways putting down science or against science. No, I think science is great. It's helped human beings in many, many, many ways. But I think, your way of putting it, that it needs to stay in its lane.
Yeah.
Right. And so if we go to science to answer every question, I think we're going to be barking up the wrong tree. We're going to be demanding of science something that it can't, in principle, provide for us.
Communism and a brand of latter-day socialism promoted the Marxist notion that religion is the opium of the people. This, Christopher, you argue, relies on what's called the genetic fallacy. What is the genetic fallacy, and could you answer the question, is religion the opium of the people?
Yeah, the genetic fallacy is judging the truth or falsity of a belief based on the origin of the belief. And it's a fallacy because you can have a true belief despite the origin of the belief being something that is generally not reliable. So, for instance, there's been scientific discoveries that have come as a result of dreams. And yet you wouldn't say that a dream is generally a good, reliable way to make scientific discoveries. So you can have a true belief, and yet the origin or genesis of that belief is, faulty or suspect or whatever. So how does that relate to this idea that religion is the opium of the masses? Well, I think the idea is something like this, that people suffer, and therefore they imagine or wish that there were a God who could provide a relief for the suffering. Or they imagine that there's a God who provides an afterlife. So right now they're having a bad life, but they say, okay, well, God exists and God could grant me heaven. And so that's going to kind of console me here and now. And that'll be the opium, the drug I take, that's going to detach me from reality right here and now. And I hope for heaven. And I think part of the problem with this view is, two things. Even if it were true that that's the origin of religious belief, that wouldn't actually show that religious belief is false. In other words, it could be that God really does exist, and that one way God prompts people to move towards acknowledging his existence is through making them dissatisfied with the realities here below. But the other problem with the belief is I don't think even this account is really accurate. I mean, if we were making up a religion to suit our own wishes and desires and purposes, well, the first thing I would do is make up a religion in which there was no sin, that I could just do anything I wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
I'd make up a religion in which it wasn't possible for me to do a serious action and end up in hell. I would change, if I were making it up, I would just change all kinds of things.
Yeah.
So at least if you're a Catholic, it's for almost all Catholics, there are things that God reveals that cut against the grain and that are challenging and difficult. So think, for instance, about one of the most challenging Catholic teachings, I think, the teaching of Jesus, is about forgiveness. To really forgive people that harm you and wrong you and cause you suffering is unbelievably hard.
Yeah.
And so, you think, look, if I just made up my own religion, I wouldn't bother with that. I wouldn't bother with the obligation to help the poor. Right? I want to keep all my money.
Mm-hmm.
So the religion doesn't seem simply to be, at least Catholicism isn't, hey, just project whatever you want to be the case, and your religion's custom made to correspond to whatever your existing desires are. And I think part of the reason for that is, on the Catholic view, your existing desires may need purification.
Mm.
So think of Dante's journey up the mountain of purgatory in the Divine Comedy, right? That whole journey up the mountain is the journey of purification of desire, correction of desire, developing new desires, extinguishing old desires and getting new desires. So I think it's a mistake philosophically to think what's basic to us is our current desires, and we just go with that. Because, in fact, our current desires may not be actually desires for what is actually best for us. So we shouldn't go with that, right? What we should go for, is cultivating desires such that we move towards, imperfectly, but move towards desiring what's actually good for us. And if we do that successfully, eventually, if we get up the mountain of purgatory, we actually will want and desire what actually is good for us, rather than having faux desires that end up leading us to inner frustration and inner disharmony.
It is striking, what a series of paradoxes there are in our faith. The last shall be first, love your enemies, a God who sacrifices himself, a God who speaks with the language of abandonment, why have you forsaken me? Again, a God who's born as a basically an itinerant baby in a cave or a stable or what have you. I mean, they all run against the grain of what we would expect. It's funny. Once upon a time, I read something that someone had said. It would take a God to invent this God, because it's just so runs so counter to any narrative we've ever come across. But also, it runs counter to sort of, as you just described, what our desires are, what our impulses are. And I'm with you. I'd craft things that could be a lot easier. And yet, as you have said, when you go through the process of denying yourself and hewing yourself to what God has on offer, or what He expects of us, as hard as it may be, you arrive at a place that is purely more right, even though we don't arrive at perfection here on earth. And so Chesterton has a great line that basically says, every generation is converted by the saint that contradicts it the most. And he also says, we don't need a church that's right where we're right. We need a church that's right where we're wrong. And it's these correctives, obviously, that bring us to obviously closer to God, but they're also unexpected and difficult. So I appreciate all that you just said about that. Christopher, in your chapter, Are We All Atheists? You write, quote, atheists themselves give ample evidence that the question of God's existence is a matter of significance. Why bother refuting a view if that view has no significance whatsoever? The efforts of atheists to show that there is no God is itself evidence that the question of God's existence is tremendously significant. Close quote. Could you elaborate on that a little bit, and then also weigh in on the one God further argument?
Sure. So I do think that the efforts of atheists to argue against God are strong evidence that the question of God really does matter. And so this is relevant for the one God further argument in the following way. One argument for atheism is to say this: everyone already is an atheist about most gods. So you don't believe in Hera, you don't believe in Zeus, you don't believe in Aphrodite. You go through the list of Egyptian gods, Greek gods. You and I both would say, well, I don't think any of those gods exist.
Mm-hmm.
No Horus, no Neptune, no Mars, etc. And so the argument goes, well, maybe you should go one step further and be consistent and just deny the reality of all gods. And the idea, I think, is to sort of minimize the distinctiveness of atheism. Say, well, look, it's really already you're 99.9% an atheist, and this is just going just a little bit further. And so it's minimizing the significance of the one step further. Mm. And I would agree with you. There are cases where just subtracting one doesn't matter at all. So if you think about how many eyelashes do you have? I don't know exactly, but if you just got rid of one, would it matter? No, it wouldn't matter. It doesn't really matter just taking away one. Or if you think of a plate of French fries, right? And you've got salt, they're salted French fries, and you just take away 1 grain of salt. Does that matter? Well, no, it doesn't matter. I mean, you wouldn't even notice 1 grain of salt. But in other cases, subtracting one is unbelievably significant. Mm-hmm. Think about the difference between a couple that has one child and then that same couple has their child, killed or something. Well, that's enormous significance.
Yes.
Or the difference between being a single person and being a married person. Why is that just one spouse? Well, yeah, but one spouse makes a big difference. I mean, if you have one spouse, you're married. And that's different than being single. Or to put it the other way, if you're married and your spouse dies, there's an enormous difference, as any widower or widow can tell you, between being married and losing just your one spouse. And so the question is God's existence something like one more grain of, salt on fries, or one more or one less eyelash doesn't matter? Or is it something that does matter? Well, it seems pretty obvious it does matter. And the reason it matters is that even atheists concede that it matters. If it really didn't matter at all, well, atheists wouldn't bother even addressing the question. They'd say, well, this is just totally insignificant, so who cares? Just like we don't address the question, how many eyelashes do you have? I'm guessing even though you've been a physician, you've never counted your patient's eyelashes and say, well, you've got 47, and I'm really concerned because, last week you had 48, and we got to really address this issue. And it doesn't matter at all.
Right.
Right? Whether,
exactly.
Yeah. So that's the way I would think about the one God more question.
Yeah, that's terrific. In your chapter, Is the Bible True? You write, quote, as Jordan Peterson puts it, quote, in the mythological world, what matters is what's important. The world is made out of what matters, not of matter. It requires a very different orientation, close quote. And William Bruce Cameron once made a similar point, quote, not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted, close quote. So, Christopher, how does one use the word myth in describing the Bible without giving the impression that it is untrue?
Yeah, I think part of the problem is for most people when they use the term myth, they just mean a made-up story that isn't true.
Yeah.
And the thing is, I don't think there's any necessity in challenging how people are using the term. And that's why I would say in general, I probably wouldn't talk about the Bible as myth unless I really tried to explain.
Yeah.
Okay, what I mean by myth is, and my way of talking about it would be something like this. First, what the Bible's not. The Bible's not aiming to be a contemporary work of scientific investigation.
Yeah.
It's just not doing that. And so if we read it, I'm going to get the most recent scientific knowledge out of the Bible, I think we're looking in the wrong place. It's fine to look for the latest contemporary scientific knowledge, and we should look in contemporary scientific texts, but the Bible isn't trying and failing to do that. It's doing something different. So what is it doing? What I would say is it's doing a lot. I don't think we can say of the Bible, because it's a collection of books, that it's just after a single purpose, except to say this. If Augustine's right, the whole point of the Bible, the whole thing from the very beginning at Genesis to Revelation, is to help us to love God and to love other people. He thought that was the key point of the whole Bible. Now, if he's right, then we need to approach the Bible in that spirit, in that overall horizon, that the Bible's goal is to foster love of God and love of neighbor. And that's why Augustine said, when you're reading the Bible, it's possible to exclude erroneous interpretations while also including multiple true interpretations. So what I mean is, Augustine thinks, and I think he's right, that you and I could read the very same passage in the Bible, and you might come away with one inspiration for your life, and I might come away with a different inspiration for my life. Maybe you come away with the inspiration, I really need to spend more time with my children.
Mm-hmm.
And I come away with the inspiration, I need to spend more time alone with God in prayer.
Mm-hmm.
And let's say, for the sake of argument, you can't do both, right? You have to choose.
Yeah.
And Augustine would say, look, both of our interpretations can be correct. It really could be the case that God is telling you, you need to spend more time with your kids. God is actually telling me you need to spend more time alone in conversation with God. But Augustine said, even though there can be multiple true interpretations of the Bible that are all aimed at fostering love of God and love of neighbor, and since you and I are in different situations, what you need to do and what I need to do may not be identical. And yet, Augustine also said there can be false interpretations of the Bible. So what would that be? Well, that would be where I read a biblical text and come away with the opposite of loving God, loving neighbor, and loving myself. So I open up Scripture and I read Judas hanged himself. And then I go a little bit further and I read, go and do likewise. And I go, oh, I should kill myself. Well, no, I should love all human beings. And so I should love myself. So of course I shouldn't go kill myself. So that's Augustine's way of thinking about it. And I think that when we think about the Bible in that way, it's much more helpful than thinking about it in the way that, again, sometimes some both atheistic readers of the Scripture and also some fundamentalist readers of Scripture. They tend to share actually a kind of wooden, science-oriented hermeneutic horizon. So they're looking for confirming science, denying science, and stuff. And I think, again, that's just the wrong way to approach this text.
Hi, I'm Tod Worner, Managing Editor of Evangelization Culture, the journal of the Word on Fire Institute. Word on Fire is a global evangelical community that exists to provide our members with the resources they need to proclaim Christ to a secular culture. Our award-winning quarterly journal, Evangelization Culture, is offered exclusively to Word on Fire Institute members. It's a tangible representation of our mission and goal to lead with beauty in order to bring others to the knowledge of truth. Inside each issue, you'll find writing from premier scholars and inspiring pieces on literature, culture, and daily life from fellow missionaries on the journey to know and serve Christ. Get a copy of the current issue of the Evangelization Culture Journal for free by visiting wordonfire.org/journal. Thank you, and join us in bringing Christ to a hungry culture. Segment 3, The Problem of Evil. In the Enchiridion, St. Augustine writes, quote, "For the Almighty God, who as even the heathen acknowledge, has supreme power over all things, being himself supremely good, would never permit the existence of anything evil among his works, if he were not so omnipotent and good that he can bring good even out of evil." Close quote. So, Christopher, in your studies, where does the problem of evil rank in the reasons why people struggle with their belief in God?
I would guess it's probably second. I think that after the alleged problem of science and faith, probably for most people, it's the second. And part of the reason for that, I think, is that it's not just a theoretical issue for people. Yeah. It's also an existential issue. Yeah. And it's true of me, and it's true, I think, for most people. If you're going through difficult circumstances, something that's really challenging and terribly hard, it's very easy to say, well, oh man, how could God possibly allow this? I mean, maybe God doesn't exist. I'm going through this terrible situation. I just can't believe it. It's so awful. And so people can be tempted to say, look, I suppose it can't be a God if God is allowing this to happen. And I've been lucky in life because I've never really gone through terrible, terrible suffering. I've never been in a concentration camp. I've never had my children murdered. I mean, there are people that go through things that are just like,
Yeah.
I just don't even know. I don't even know how I'd get out of bed if, something like that happened. And yet I think that part of thinking about this issue, so there's two issues. There's the theoretical problem, the thought, the philosophy, and there's the existential problem. So let me say a word about the theoretical problem. The theoretical problem, I think, part of the way to consider this is to recall the reality of our own cognitive limitations. And what I mean by that is almost everyone in their own life has gone through something difficult, and then later, maybe 5 years later, maybe 10, recognize that, I'm glad that happened, right? I'm glad that high school relationship ended, because at the time I thought, oh my gosh, I so, want to be with this person. And now I can say, oh my gosh, if I'd actually gotten married to, my high school girlfriend, oh, it would have been terrible. It would have been a total wipeout and disaster. So, people can recognize in many cases, and I know in my life I have, something that happened before that at the time was really not good, not enjoyable.
Yeah.
And yet you can recognize later that it's sort of worthwhile. So I think the cognitive problem of evil is in a way easier to address, I'd say, than the existential problem of evil. And the existential problem of evil is, what I mean by that is when you're actually in the midst of suffering. You are, something terrible happened, you're so disappointed, you're so frustrated, and that is really hard. And I think for people in that situation, I think philosophy isn't the right tool to use to wrestle with that. So what is the right tool? I would say two things. I would say writing can be a good tool. So there's a lot of research that indicates that when you write about negative emotions, it really helps domesticate them and get them out of your head and onto the page, and therefore more under control. So one thing that I do is, and this is based on some research that I've read, is write a letter to myself. So the letter would go something like this. It's a 3-part letter. So I'd write, Dear Christopher, I understand that you're really upset about what happened at work. It's really frustrating when you feel like you're working hard and the bosses don't recognize what you're doing, and then you're excluded and you're frustrated and this and that. And you kind of explain in as much length as you want your current upsetness about whatever situation it is. Mm-hmm. The second part of your letter, what you do is you universalize that. So then you think about all the people around the world right now and also in the past who've gone through something very similar. If you think about all the people around the world who've had a boss that didn't like them or didn't treat them fairly, they thought, or whatever, I mean, there's probably most people who have worked. It's like, they had a boss at some point that was like on their case or whatever. So you write about that. You universalize your suffering. And this is important because then you recognize, what? I'm not unique. I'm not alone. It's not like a bolt of lightning hit me and no one else ever. This is a common human experience. I'm part of common humanity. We almost all have had bosses or teachers that have kind of, at least we thought, not treated us fairly, etc. And then in the last part of the letter, what you do is you write about what a very wise, experienced, good person would recommend to you to move forward in a positive way. So like in the scenario I'm imagining, I might write, this thing didn't work out the way you hoped, but that doesn't exclude the possibility of you making a contribution in whatever way you want. This doesn't exclude the possibility of you actually serving other people and helping other people, right? So yes, you didn't get whatever it is you didn't get, but this doesn't shackle you. You're not like locked in a dungeon or something and you can't do anything. You can make contributions, you can move forward, and maybe even paradoxically, this is going to be a moment of growth. Many times we grow through things that are difficult and tough. You think certainly of our physical health. Like if you want to get big muscles and be, strong, you have to go to the gym. You have to hit the weights. You have to, and you're not going to grow your muscles larger if all you're doing is picking up a pencil. You need to do something more, strenuous. So growth, whether it's physical growth and also intellectual growth, comes through challenge. And so maybe in the third part of the letter, I said, look, this is a challenge. This is a chance, though, because it is a challenge. This is a chance and opportunity to grow in skills of dealing with negative emotion. It's a chance to grow in virtue of patience and virtues of generosity, and it's a chance to grow in love. And so you reframe it in this sort of positive way. So the three-part letter I find very, very helpful in dealing with negative emotions, because the fact is we all go through suffering, right? There's no way, hopefully it's not terrible, terrible suffering, a child dying, but we all go through suffering. And so we all need tools to deal with our own difficulties. And so I think writing about it is a really good way to deal with it. And then the other way is to talk to friends, to talk to people that care about you and want what's best for you, and say, oh my gosh, I'm so upset. This happened and I'm really frustrated. And if you're talking to a good friend who's a good person, the person will be able to give you, listen to you, be compassionate, echo back to you. Oh, I'm hearing you saying that you're really frustrated about your boss. Yeah, I am. I really am. And then this processing also helps get it out of you. So I think when we're suffering and we have a lot of negative emotions, it can kind of be stuck in our head. We go to bed and it swims around and it swirls around in our mind like, oh, I'm so frustrated. I can't believe that. And then you think, I should have said this. I should have said that. Oh, no. And then you go back to the original thing and it just swirls around in your mind. Whereas I think writing about it or saying it to a friend are both ways of getting it out of your mind and therefore domesticating it, making it easier to deal with. So when people are going through the existential problem of evil and suffering, I think those two things can be helpful tools to try to work through in a positive way the difficulty.
Great advice. Great advice. Christopher, at one point or another, it may seem to many of us that God is too well hidden. Psalm 13 finds David asking, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? And even Jesus Christ, hanging from a cross, asked of God the Father, why have you forsaken me? How do you approach this in your chapter, Why Isn't God's Existence Obvious?
I approach it, I start with talking about a movie Steve Martin did called The Man with Two Brains. And in this movie, the Steve Martin character is standing before a portrait of his deceased wife. And he comes to her and he says, Rebecca, if there's any reason I shouldn't marry my girlfriend, just give me a sign and let me know. And all of a sudden, the lights start to blink and there's a huge windstorm and the portrait starts to spin on the wall. And the voice comes from the grave, no, 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 louder and louder. And then after about 15 seconds, the winds die down and the portrait, lands askew on the wall and the voice is gone. And then Martin says, just a sign, anything will do. So I thought that's a super funny scene, which does indicate that, when we're looking for signs, part of it rests on us. In other words, you can have signs that you don't see because you're sort of closed to it and blind to it, as the Steve Martin character was, closed and blind to the signs given from his dead wife that he shouldn't pursue his girlfriend. And so is God hidden? Yes, in a way, God is hidden. And part of that is that because we are gaining knowledge through our senses, right? Most of the knowledge we gain is through seeing things and hearing things and touching things and tasting things. So most of our knowledge comes in through our senses. And so that's where our knowledge begins. And God isn't present to our senses in that way. We don't see God with our eyes. We don't touch God with our hands. And so God is not directly present. Now, why is that? Well, one reason, at least one reason C.S. Lewis thought, is that if God did appear to us directly and manifestly, God would be so overwhelming and so beautiful and so attractive that basically we would be drawn to God without any decision on our own. In other words, we would just be like a tractor beam, basically. And so God remains hidden in part to allow us the freedom to love God or not to love God. He gives us the freedom to choose, and therefore the freedom to be in a relationship with him. And so I think that God is hidden from us, yes, but God also discloses himself to us. And so as Catholics, we believe God discloses himself to us in the sacraments. God discloses himself in the scripture. God discloses himself in our relationships with other people. God discloses himself in nature. So God does disclose himself. God does send signs, as it were. And typically the signs aren't, an apparition appearing to you. I guess sometimes that happens to some people, but typically they're the more subtle, the more not overwhelming signs. And this is very much in keeping with the Gospels, right? Jesus doesn't come to earth as a 12-foot tall Samson, a UFC fighter that's going to overpower everyone with his force and lead an army. Jesus comes into human existence as a little tiny child and then leaves his earthly life as a man dying on a cross. So in other words, not overpowering, but rather hopefully alluring. Why alluring? Well, there's two kinds of human beings that people really are not too afraid of. First is obviously babies. I mean, I don't know anyone who's afraid of a baby because they're so gentle and cuddable, and they're not going to harm you at all. And then also someone who's suffering and dying. That also hopefully elicits from us compassion and the desire to help. But again, not fear typically. I don't think you're afraid of someone who's dying, that they're going to get up and harm you because they're too suffering, and they themselves need saving. So I think God's actions in Jesus reveal something about God's plan for us, that he's not aiming to overpower us, to knock us over. Yes, are there some rare cases of that, Paul getting knocked off his horse? Yeah, okay. But for the most part, the way of Jesus doesn't seem to be to use force, but to use persuasion and to use invitation and to use these more subtle ways of wooing us and prompting us hopefully to get into a loving relationship with him.
To your point of all this, it makes me think also of when one has, think about all the dark times we have, just even reading in the scripture, the Passion Week, how many moments of grace emerge during the stations of the cross, where Jesus, he has a moment with Veronica, or when he's on the cross and he has a conversation, in gasps with, was it Andrew and with Mary, when he says, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." I mean, in the midst of this horror show of the Passion, he is still dispensing grace, and similar to one of my favorite books, The Diary of a Country Priest. It's kind of a brutal book of effectively a saint, effectively priest, who is dying throughout the whole book, and yet there are pictures, shafts of light of grace that pour through it, that are so often to the untrained or the unfaithful eye, or just the human eye that is dominated by suffering. You're world blind to the grace that comes through it. And yet, as Bernano ends his book, the priest is saying grace is everywhere. And so one of the things I'll say to my students, my either medical students, residents, but also my undergrad students, is the notion that suffering and grace are often twinned, but the problem is that suffering is a prima donna. And grace is the quiet or more modest character that you miss because of the brashness of suffering. And yet there she is, waiting, enduring, and ultimately overpowering the suffering that preceded her, or what have you. So anyway, I love what you're saying about this, and I think it makes an awful lot of sense. It's a very, very powerful chapter that you write on this. I wanted to ask you, Christopher, also in another chapter, "Can evil be a means to a good?" I was very moved by the story of the Chinese farmer. Could you tell people this story and what we should learn from it?
Sure. Yeah, the story of the Chinese farmer begins where you have a widower and a son, and they're on this farm and they're working the farm, and they're very poor, and they just have this one horse. And one day the horse escapes from the farm because the son didn't lock the gate properly. And all the villagers come over to the poor old farmer and they say, "Oh my gosh, this is a tragedy. This is awful. Now you don't have your horse anymore. You and your son are going to starve, basically. How can you work the land? It's just a total catastrophe. It's a tragedy." And then the Chinese farmer says, "Maybe yes, maybe no." Well, the very next day, the horse that escaped returned, and it actually brought with it. It met these other horses out in the wild, and returned with 6 other horses. So now the farmer has 7 horses, and the son, closes the gate. Now he's got 7 horses. This is great. The villagers run over and they talk to the farmer and say, "This is fantastic. You have 7 horses now. You can sell maybe 3, 4, 5 at market. You have more horses to work the land. You're going to be so wealthy. What a windfall. This is absolutely fantastic." And the farmer says, "Well, maybe yes, maybe no." Well, the very next day, the son is on one of the horses trying to break in one of the wild horses to sell. and the wild horse throws the son. The son breaks his leg terribly. Oh gosh, the villagers come over and talk to the old farmers. Oh, this is a catastrophe. Your one son, now he has a broken leg. He can't help you. This is a disaster. This is, I'm so sorry for you. What a tragedy. The farmer says, maybe yes, maybe no. And then finally, the very next day, in comes a representative of the emperor, and he says, we're enrolling every able-bodied young man to fight on the front lines of this battle. We're going to have to fight for our lives, and they're going to have to be in the front line. It's going to be very dangerous. So say goodbye to your son, and men may never see him again. And then the villagers come over to the farmer and say, "Oh gosh, this is so great. You're so fortunate. Your son's not going to have to die in battle now. This is great." And the farmer again says, maybe yes, maybe no. So what is the story about? I think the story is about, it can be interpreted in different ways. But I think one way to think about it would be this. We ought not to look at either the triumphs or the tragedies of our lives simply in small scale. In other words, just this snapshot. Because, every tragedy or every triumph is connected in a larger picture. And so things that seem terrible can actually, it turns out, be somewhat beneficial. Things that seem beneficial actually, it turns out, can be somewhat of a tragedy. So life is really unpredictable. So we can say, yes, it's bad to break your leg. It's good to be healthy. Yes, but even breaking your leg can, in fact, be used as a means to something that was good. So it turned out to be good that this young farmer wasn't sent off to the front lines to fight against an overwhelming enemy and probably die. So I think that's part of it. And then I think part of the story too is about, well, what really is ultimately a tragedy? And there was a French writer, Léon Blanc, who said, there's only one tragedy in life, not to be a saint. And if that's right, then I think the smaller tragedies, the smaller setbacks and difficulties we encounter could, in God's providence, turn out to be just part of the divine plan to get us where God wants us to be, so as to get to our ultimate home of heaven. And if it was necessary to break my leg or to not get this job or to get fired or to get whatever, and that really is part of God's plan in order to get me and get those that I love where God wants us ultimately to be, well, then in the end, it would be all worth it. So in the end, there's only one tragedy, not to be a saint. And, hopefully we'll be able to get there. I guess we have to say maybe yes, maybe no, but hopefully we'll be able to get there.
The Stoic philosopher Epictetus once offered, quote, "There are things that are within our power, and there are things which are beyond our power. Within our power are opinion, aim, desire, aversion, and in one word, whatever affairs are our own. Beyond our power are body, property, reputation, office, and in one word, whatever are not properly our own affairs," close quote. So, Christopher, why do we have such difficulty accepting those things beyond our control, or maybe even saying surrendering, as opposed to relentlessly clamoring for control of the uncontrollable?
I think you're right. This is a recurring human temptation to try to control things that are either outside of our control or things that should be outside of our control, things we should allow others to control. So this is a recurring temptation, and you're right. The ancient Stoics were one of the first to put their finger on this problem, because it really does cause problem for us. If we rest our hopes and our desires on things outside of our control, we're really setting ourselves up for serious suffering and serious difficulty. So I think one of the insights of Christianity that's so important is that what ultimately matters is something that is in our control. In this sense, salvation is a gift, but because God is good, God is never going to just, withdraw salvation from someone. God gives this gift of salvation, but if there's going to be a rupture in our relationship, it's going to be caused by us, not caused by God. And so what Christianity is saying in that teaching is that we actually do have control over this thing that matters most, our eternal relationship with God. God is always going to love us. God is always going to be there, but we may move away from God. Lou Holtz said one time that if you feel far from God, who do you think it is that moved?
Good one.
right? And you say, well,
yeah.
I mean, it's not that God stopped loving me, it's that I stopped loving God.
Yes.
And so Christianity gives, you might say, us back a locus of control where you say, look, I can't control the weather. I can't control what other people do. I can influence to a degree, but can't really control what happens in the world in terms of politics and world affairs or whatever. But I always do have control over my choice to love God in return. And since God is always loving me, if I choose to love God in return, if I choose to respond to God's grace, inviting me to love Him in return, well, then I can have a loving relationship with God. And then I can actually have what matters most. Because at the end of the day, that does matter most, right? You can have all kinds of money, all kinds of power, honors, positions. But if you don't have love, what in the end, what does that add up to? But if you have love, well, that is something, again, that you can decide. So many things out of my control, but I can hopefully choose with God's help to love God, to love other people, and to love myself properly. And that gives me control over what's most important.
That's a really good way of putting it. And in that maybe, just maybe, and probably not maybe, those things which are out of our control, it's good that they're out of our control. We're clamoring after that which we shouldn't be clamoring after, when in fact our eternal destiny, heaven or hell, being within our grasp. Again, us not earning our way, it's a gift of grace. But like you said, controlling the rupture of your controlling your relationship with God in terms of not being ruptured from Him within your control. As you've said, the things that matter the most, you have control over. The things that matter probably the least, but seem sometimes to matter the most, you lack control over. And we just have to change our perspective about the control we do have. Is that fair to say?
I think so. Yeah. And that's part of the problem of idolatry. So in other words, if you think about someone who makes an idol out of power, and they spend all their time and all their energy trying to become governor of California, trying to become president of the United States or whatever, well, they can do that. But at the end of the day, that really is not in anyone's control, right? In other words, you can try to become governor, you can try to become president. Can you make that happen? No, the best you could do is like give speeches and do your best to campaign and raise money. But at the end of the day, that's not in your control. It's the power of the people to either elect you or not. And so I think people can spend so much time and energy focusing on things that really are not out of their control. And it's fine to run for governor, it's fine to run for president. But what I think is not fine is making it an idol, right? Making power an idol, making honor an idol, making riches an idol, making pleasure an idol, whatever it is. All those are ways of failing to love God, to love your neighbor, and to love yourself properly. And so I think the Stoic insight about distinguishing what's under your control and what's not actually can help us see why idols get in the way of our happiness. Because all these idols are things that really are not ultimately under our power. So if we idolize those and say, well, I can only be happy if I make this much money, or if I have this position, or if I have this power or this pleasure, and I don't get it, well, I'm going to be miserable. Right. But part of the reason I'm miserable is that I have set myself up for disappointment and misery by placing my happiness, resting my happiness on these things outside my power. Whereas the Christian view would be that if you correspond to God's love, you can have some degree of happiness, even if other things that would be good to have, you are deprived of. And so I think that's a very powerful message, especially for people that are suffering and having difficulties. Right? Where you say, look, yes, you're right. You can't, this is not going to work out. This desire you had is not going to pan out, but you are not deprived of what matters most. That is still under your power. So I'm glad you emphasized, though, I'm not saying you earn your salvation or
No.
I think of it something like this. Your physical life is a gift that you received. None of us caused ourselves to become alive, but given that we have been given this gift of physical life, can I destroy this? Can I ruin this? Yeah, I can. I can not take care of my health. I can even actively try to destroy myself. So I can destroy this gift of physical life that I've been given. And likewise, I've been given a gift of divine life. I was baptized, and so I was given this gift. Now, could I destroy it? Yeah, I could. I could destroy it. Now, hopefully I won't. But none of that takes away the reality that physical life or spiritual life is a gift from God. But I still have some control over that in the sense of I can nurture this life. I can try to be healthy. I can try to be spiritually healthy, or I can neglect that and become weaker and become, undermine this, either the physical life I've been given or the spiritual life I've been given.
You have 2 chapters devoted to whether any evil or pointless evil disproves God's existence. You delve into the quote, logical problem of evil and the quote, evidential problem of evil. So what are these 2 problems of evil, and does evil in fact disprove God's existence?
Yeah, so there's 2 different versions of the problem of evil, the logical and the evidential that you just distinguished. And the difference is this: the logical problem of evil holds that if there's any evil at all, if there's just one person who has a toothache, one person who has a sore throat, that's enough to disprove God's existence. And I think the logical problem of evil ends up not really disproving God's existence, in part because there really isn't a logical contradiction between the claim God exists and there is evil in the world. Those aren't actually logically incompatible. And part of the reason they're not logically incompatible is that it could be that God allows certain evils for the sake of a greater good, or God allows certain evils so that to prevent even greater evils. And everyone can recognize this in other cases. So my wife and I have children. We chose to bring children into this world. And when we chose to do that, we knew that they would suffer, that they would have problems, right? I mean, no one's born and lives their whole life and everything's perfect every day.
Yeah.
And yet we allowed that. Now, was that evil of us? Should we just never have had kids because we foresaw, our kid would fall off their bike and whatever else?
Yeah.
Well, no. I mean, we judge, I think correctly, that it's good for my kids to be alive. And my kids think the same thing, right? My kids enjoy being alive, despite the difficulties. So yes, of course there's difficulties, but people judge, I think correctly, that it's a good thing to bring kids into the world. And then people that are alive, almost all of them, judge, despite the difficulties in my life, I'm glad I'm here. Yeah. I'm glad I'm alive. So the logical problem of evil, I don't think is really going to work. Then it leaves us with the evidential problem of evil. And the evidential version is this: there's too much evil in the world. There's too much suffering in the world. Yes, if it's just a case of one person with a toothache, okay, yeah, that's compatible with God's existence. But given the huge amount of suffering that exists, that is not compatible. And I think the way to think about this problem is to remember that part of the problem of evil is to try to show that Christian belief is inconsistent in itself. So the idea here would be, if you claim that God is all good, and you claim God is all knowing, and you claim God's all powerful, God would get rid of all evil. And yet there's all this evil around. There's lots of evil. But I think when you're talking about comparing goods and evils, that only makes sense if you think about the overall picture, right? In other words, it's not enough to just look at a snapshot and say, well, okay, I'm judging on the snapshot and that's it. Think, for instance, about human existence and say all you had was a snapshot of a woman in the midst of giving birth at the most painful moment of transition. You say, well, this is human life.
Yeah.
And you say, well, it's not worth it. This is terrible. Look at, she's crying, she's screaming. This is terrible. It's not worth it to have human life at all. But I think if you have a broader picture and you say, well, look, yes, there's that moment and that is hard. There's no 2 ways about it. But also there's the day after when she's has her baby and she loves her baby and she's crying with joy because of her baby. There's when that child goes to kindergarten. There's when that child gets married and the mom is again crying because she loves the baby. So, and then when she becomes a grandmother. So it's not an accurate view to say, well, all we do is take the snapshot right here and now, because there's all these things, both preceding and subsequent, that are relevant for assessing the meaning of what happened during transition, which was hard, which was very painful. And so I think the same thing is true of human life. Yes, there are terrible sufferings, unbelievable sufferings in human life. And I certainly haven't even gone through a quarter of what many people have gone through. And yet, I think to make an accurate judgment of the situation, we can't just take a snapshot and say, well, here it is, this life, and it's terrible. We have to take a broader view. And the broader view would be this: imagine even the very worst human life that you can imagine. So you think of pain as a matter of intensity and duration, right? So you'd say, okay, what's the worst life you could have? Maximum pain, right? Intensity, over the longest duration. So what's the longest duration? Let's say human beings maximally live 120 years. I think the all-time record is something like that. Make it 130 years, right? As far as I know, there's never been a documented case of someone living more than 130 years. So you have someone who's born and they're just tortured their whole 130 years. That's all that happens in their life. They're just tortured. So that's the worst possible human life, the worst possible human suffering. Now, if you had that, it's called the bitter pill. And if it's true that there is eternal life, and if eternal life is maximal joy, well, then you have the maximums matched up. But then the duration of that is not going to be 130 years or even 130 million years or even 130 billion years. It's maximal. It's infinity. So that terrible, terrible pill, that bitter pill of suffering, that would be like, one pill, one aspirin.
Yeah.
Well, if you put that in the ocean, it's completely overwhelmed. But then if you put it not just in the ocean, but you say, well, this is just one planet. Think of all the planets, think of all space. I mean, that little aspirin is almost insignificant.
Yeah.
It is dwarfed in comparison. And that's why Paul says, I count my current sufferings as nothing in comparison to the glories that await us, right? So there's a kind of discounting, not in the sense of a denial. Suffering is suffering. Suffering is terrible. It's not a denial of that, but it's a contextualization that you say you can't just look at the moment of transition and say, well, that's all it is. Yes, that's true, and that is a moment, but there's a lot more to being a parent and a mother and having a kid than just the moment of transition. So too, yes, there are bitter pills in human life, terrible, terrible suffering. But if the Christian view is right, there's an overall context that puts that suffering in a context that makes our suffering to almost count as nothing in comparison to the glory that awaits us.
What's very interesting about this is your use of the word context, which I love because clearly suffering grabs our attention. It almost renders us incapable. I mean, supreme or severe suffering, of which, like you, I haven't experienced even a fragment of what many people have. It almost makes you incapable of conceiving of anything outside of the blinding suffering you're going through, imagining the worst of the worst scenarios. And yet your counsel of the notion of context, of understanding, this too shall pass in one form or the other, or that heaven awaits, or understanding where this fits into the grander scheme of your soul, of protecting, say, if it comes down to you're protecting your family, or you're enduring a terrible illness, and you're demonstrating a certain tenacity that inspires your family or inspires your friends, or whatever the case may be. My point is that when you consider what you've just described, context, it's difficult to see context in the midst of blinding pain or blinding grief or whatever, and yet it's still there. It's still, you can't alter the truth that there is a context to this. And when you ultimately do the analysis of the context, it does frame it up in such a way as to say this pain compared to what awaits, as long as it may be, as maximal as it may be, is ephemeral compared to the eternal. Am I capturing this somewhat correctly?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I do totally agree with you that in the moment of grave suffering, we can't think of anything else. I mean, if you have, hit your thumb with a hammer really hard and break your thumb, of course, all you can think about is your thumb.
Yeah.
But in fact, there's other realities that do exist. For instance, your foot, your other hand, your eyes, there's all kinds of parts of you that are really there. But in the moment, all you can think about is your thumb. It just completely overwhelms you. And there's a reason for that, right? We want to move away from things that can harm us. And so if we put our hand on the hot stove and we just, it's like,
think
fine, or we're going to, think about it for 10 minutes. Well, it's going to injure us, more severely. So there's good reason that pain grabs our attention, as you say, because we need to get our hand off the hot stove. We need to stop hitting our thumb with the hammer. Otherwise, we'll get more and more injured. So there's reason for that immediacy and that overwhelming urge to, I get away from the hot stove. And yet, it is a mistake, I think, to say, well, all that exists is the hot stove. All that exists is the pain. And again, I think in our own lives, almost everyone's experienced times where they went through something terrible, and yet on the other side, it might be 10 or even 20 years later, they say, okay, that was awful, but I can now see there was a meaning to that. There was an importance to that. And part of Christianity, I think, that's so helpful is this grounding of hope. So in other words, the Christian can always say truthfully, this terrible thing I'm going through is not going to last forever. Why? Well, because we're going to die at some point and then it's over, right? So it's not going to last forever. It doesn't ruin everything. Why? Because no matter how terrible your suffering is, none of that can undermine your love of God, your love of neighbor, God's love for you, right? So think of Jesus, think of Mary. They suffered terribly, but that didn't undermine their love for God, and God still loved them. And there's always something that we can do about it. We can always offer our suffering up. We can always unite our suffering to the suffering of Jesus. So in a way, this is the opposite of what the psychologist Martin Seligman called learned helplessness. So some people, when they go through suffering, say, this is going to last forever. This ruins everything. And there's nothing I can do about it. And that leads them to feel totally helpless, and it really debilitates them. And so that's why I think Christians, because of hope, are able to have, even in terrible suffering, the opposite of learned helplessness, right? They're able to say, this is not going to last forever. There's something I can do about it, and it doesn't ruin everything. And all that is very helpful for Christians to be able to cope with the inevitable sufferings, because the fact is everybody suffers, right? There's no remedy. If we're on this earth, we're going to suffer in one way or the other. Yeah. And so Christianity gives us real resources for dealing with that suffering.
There's a line from a particular Christian thinker that's put the finger on what you've just said about the fact that 10 or 15 years from now you look back upon it. It's faith means believing in advance what only makes sense in reverse. And that doesn't mean that we always completely understand. I think there's things that are truths that are revealed to us about our life circumstances that will come after the grave, into heaven, that things will become apparent to us. But there are aspects of, like you said, 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years from after the terrible event. Faith means believing in advance what only makes sense in reverse, and to see through it, to understand context, like you said, once you've gotten past that blinding pain, blinding grief, whatever, to what you said, it's the opposite of learned helplessness. It's terrific. Christopher, in your book, go ahead. You're about to say something.
Oh, I just was going to say, that's a fantastic quotation. I really like that a lot.
Last two questions. You've been so generous with your time. In your book, Is Belief Believable? There's a special pride of place for Eleanor Stump's work on the problem of evil. Just say a few words to people out there. Who is Eleanor Stump, and how has she contributed to the discussion of this question?
Yeah, Eleanor Stump is a professor at St. Louis University, and she is a terrific philosopher who's written I think 3 different books about the problem of evil and the problem of suffering. And her greatest book, I think, is a book called Wandering in Darkness. And the book really is a tour de force looking at contemporary philosophical treatments of the problem of evil. And one of the signature insights that Stump has is that she uses narratives, biblical narratives, to think through the problem of suffering. And so she'll look at the narrative of Samson, the narrative of Abraham, and the narrative, of course, of Job, the famous story of suffering. And in doing this, what I love about her work is that it's a very careful, attentive biblical exegesis married with a very sophisticated philosophical account of what suffering is. She basically talks about 2 different kinds of suffering. So she says one kind of suffering is where you are frustrated in terms of your flourishing. So flourishing is something shared by all human beings. It's things like being healthy, having friends. And so for all human beings, you are not flourishing if you're dying of cancer or if you're lonely and have no friends. These inhibit our flourishing, and that's shared by everybody. On the other hand, another way to suffer is to suffer in terms of the desires of your heart. And this is going to vary from person to person. So for instance, I care very much about my own children, and you care very much about your children. Now, yes, of course, I want your children to do well, and of course, you want my children to do well. But if something terrible happens to my children, it's going to affect me much more profoundly than it would affect you, right? Because they're my kids, and I want, what's good for my kids since they're my kids. So the desires of the heart are going to vary from person to person. And one way to suffer is to get thwarted in terms of the desires of your heart, right? So maybe you want to be really helpful with a group of patients to help them get over some disease. And let's say you're thwarted in that, right? You're trying to come up with some, treatments for them that are going to really work. And it turns out, oh man, all these patients die. And that's really going to hurt you because you really had your heart set on that, right? Or if we use the example of children, you might, as one of the desires of your heart, really desire that your children get a good education because you really care about that. You really want them to have the knowledge that they can therefore, go out in the world and help people more because they know more. But that could get thwarted. Maybe your kid just won't study. Your kid, drops out of high school. And that could really cause you suffering. Whereas for some other people, it's like, I don't care if my kid drops out of high school. It doesn't matter to me at all. So anyway, the desires of your heart vary from individual to individual. And what Stump does in her book is look at stories like Job, stories like Samson, and analyze them both in terms of a loss of flourishing and also in terms of a loss of the desires of their heart. And what she does is show in these stories how, in the end, actually, both in terms of their flourishing and the desires of their heart, God resolves their suffering, which is not to say that the suffering is taken away entirely or that the suffering didn't matter, but rather that God uses and works with the suffering in their lives to bring them ultimately to the place where they want to be.
Tell us the name of the book that you recommend again, so people can go to Amazon or wherever they buy their books. What's the particular work that you were recommending of hers?
Yeah, it's called Wandering in Darkness.
Okay.
Wandering in Darkness. And it's quite a substantial book. I don't recall exactly how many pages it is, but it's maybe 450 pages. It's sort of a real substantial tome. But it's well written. It is accessible. It's not some philosophical work. You'd have to really be a professional philosopher even to get into it a chapter or two. But this isn't. This is it's not aimed at popular audiences. It's aimed more at scholars. But I would encourage anyone who wants to give it a shot to check it out because it really is, I would say, the best single book I've ever read, at least, on this problem of suffering.
Terrific. We also, I have to brag that Evangelization and Culture, the journal, our quarterly journal of the Word on Fire Institute, features one of her essays a number of issues back. So if you're interested in kind of clawing your way through old journals of the Evangelization Culture, it's there for you as well. Christopher, again, super generous with your time and unbelievably insightful as always. I want to ask one final question. How has your faith been transformed in both asking and answering these fundamental questions about the existence and nature of God?
Well, I'd say my faith is always getting transformed in this sense. I've been Catholic my whole life, but I would say my faith really is an ongoing journey. And the reason for that is that even though I've always believed in God, I hope and think my relationship with God over time has been enriched and deepened through all kinds of insights. So that's why I really spend a good chunk of my time trying to read and also listen to podcasts and listen to books on Audible and such, but trying to take in content to help me to grow and develop and deepen, because I feel like I'm very much still on a journey. I don't feel like, I've got all the answers and it's in my back pocket. I feel very much like I'm trying to understand, I'm trying to move forward. And so for me, that's really an ongoing process that really can't, in this life at least, end. So there's so many books on my, to be read list that haven't been read. And, obviously, like everybody, I've got other things I have to do and other things I want to do. But I do try to make time for reading. But the other thing, too, is time for kind of spiritual life, you might say. So times of silence and times of prayer. And I think this is totally essential, right? To try to, live as a Christian and not pray is like, trying to live and not eating or something. It's like, you can kind of go along for a few days, I guess. You're going to be pretty lightheaded and pretty dizzy and not really your best self. But if you keep doing that, I don't think you can survive at all. I mean, you're going to just fall over. And so I think of, for me, part of what I try to do every day is to make, committed time to pray. And when I started this when I was 19 or 20 or something, I didn't know where it would take me, but I feel honestly very grateful to God because I don't know, I never thought my life would, unfold the way it has in fact unfolded. And I really have to give God credit for that because I think, without praying and studying and things like that, I don't know what my life would be like, but I'm grateful to God and I'm grateful to still be alive so that I have a chance to grow and get rid of hopefully vices and move towards virtue and develop. And I don't know, I feel very, very grateful to be able to, be on this journey.
Dr. Christopher Kaczor, Catholic, professor, and author of Is Belief Believable? Thank you so much for this conversation. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you, Tod. I always enjoy speaking with you, and I'm really grateful for all your insightful questions.
So I've been thinking, do you remember those formative moments in school when you didn't quite understand a math problem, a concept, or an assignment, but you were too self-conscious to ask the teacher, especially in front of the class? And then just as you sat in this vexing tension of unknowing, a hand goes up and someone else asks what you wanted to know. Instantly, there was a relief that came through a trifecta of grace. First, it felt affirming that someone else was confused. Second, you didn't have to parade your own insecurity. And third, your question was answered. It was a beautiful thing. This, in another form, is what Christopher Kaczor does for us in his thoughtful book, Is Belief Believable? Reasoning about God from Plato and Aquinas to C.S. Lewis and Jordan Peterson. He asks the questions you've always wanted to ask, but were uncertain if or how you should ask it. Are faith and reason opposed? Why is there evil? Can evil be a means to a good? Those are just a few of the over 50 questions that Christopher asks. But while the questions are good, they are only outmatched by the answers. Somehow, Christopher can engage matters of deep theological and philosophical gravity in an approachable yet intelligent way in a matter of only a few pages. It is always disappointing when a book promising to wrestle with the big questions gives weak, superficial answers. Is Belief Believable? Is decidedly not that book. From our very beginnings, we've been asking questions of God. From Job asking why he suffers, to Mary asking how her pregnancy is to be, to the disciples asking to be taught how to pray. Time and again, the bigs in our faith ask the big questions for us. Now, we have an eminent professor, Christopher Kaczor, doing the same thing. And by the way, as I found out from way back in school, when someone asks a good question about which we are also wondering, it is still a beautiful thing. And one last thing. Read Christopher Kaczor's Is Belief Believable? But also read Pope Benedict XVI's, when he was still Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, and Peter Seewald's book-length interview called God and the World. Among the myriad things that brought me to the Catholic faith, Benedict's brilliant clarity on theological and cultural matters, big and small, was one of them. Read the responses of a master theologian and faithful follower of Christ as he was asked questions by an earnest but atheist journalist who, like me, also found his way to the faith thanks to this wonderful Pope. Thank you once again for joining me on the Evangelization Culture Podcast. I'm Tod Worner, and until we meet again, keep bringing Christ to a hungry culture.